Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural Y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the writers who write it. This episode is another one of our author talk episodes where I join the authors of the books that I'm talking about to talk about their connections to rural places and people and cultures and why they choose to write rural stories. This episode is particularly interesting because it's the first time that I've gotten to sit down with multiple contributors to an anthology. I've talked to other contributing editors of anthologies before, but it was so great to have multiple perspectives on the process of contributing to an anthology, multiple perspectives on what folklore is and how it connects to place, and so many different places represented in this conversation too. So I'm so glad you're here, and I hope that you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I did want to give you a heads up that while I was talking to three of the authors on this episode, a fourth one joined a bit late. And so in the middle of the episode, another author is just going to appear and introduce herself and then join the conversation. And I'm so glad that she did because her perspectives were so helpful and insightful. And I really got a lot out of this episode in terms of just thinking about how folklore is connected to place. It gave me flashbacks to being in my rural classroom as a teacher and hearing students talk about particular bridges to stay away from, or particular graveyards or roads. There's always a devil's backbone, it seems, in all the rural towns here in Indiana, at least. And you shouldn't go on them, especially at particular times of night. And so I remember them talking about those kinds of things and how it would have been so nice to be able to teach this collection and invite them to connect to the folk stories that they grew up with and the folklore that was connected to their place, even as they were, reading stories that came from different places and different types of people and different cultures. So I'm really excited about this episode. I had a lot of fun talking to these amazing authors, and I'm still in spooky season. I know that it's pretty, well after Halloween, really, I guess. And Target already has the Christmas stuff out, but there's still something about early November before Thanksgiving. Just the way the light looks and the way the air changes, and it still feels a bit spooky to me. So I hope that you will join me in continuing the celebration of spooky season, and that you enjoy listening to the conversation. And so without further preamble, here it is. Let's get to it. Hey there, friends, and welcome to another Author Talk episode of Reading Rural Y'all, where we talk all things rural YA literature and to the writers who write it. In this episode, we'll hear from a few of the contributors to the Whippoorwill Award-winning short story collection, The Gathering Dark, which is fantastic and perfect for spooky season, y'all. So you should get you a copy for sure. I'm excited for this episode because it's the first time I've had a chance to talk with the contributors of an edited collection. And since there are so many of us in this episode, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Rather than introduce each of the authors myself, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves as they take up our first question. So welcome, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. And could you introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and how you feel that shaped who you are as a person and a writer?
Good morning. Thank you for having us, Chea. I'm Olivia Chada, and I am an author of middle grade YA and adult literature and comic books. Rise of the Red Hand is my YA debut, and I have Fall of the Iron Gods coming out next April. I'm a contributor to, from a certain point of view, Star Wars Return of the Jedi that just came out last month, and where I got to write about a droid. A lot of my research in my doctoral program has to do with liminal spaces and borders and boundaries. And that's why I think folk horror and folklore is so vital. I did some work on folklore during my doctorate program with Elizabeth Tucker at Binghamton and became obsessed with spaces outside of cities and just the spaces surrounding our unconscious mind. So, are places that kind of inhabit anxieties. My family, my parents are immigrants. I've moved a lot. I've never rooted down, but the one thing that has always kind of remained the same is the idea that I feel most comfortable in wild spaces, forested places, and things like that. So that's kind of a little bit about me. I've been displaced many times. I'm interested in borders, and then it kind of comes out in my writing in a lot of ways.
That's awesome. I think we're going to be fast friends because those are also a lot of my obsessions.
Thanks for having us. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Brown. My YA horror comedy debut, Damned If You Do, just came out in August. And I have also co-edited Night of the Living Queers, which also came out in August. August was a wild time. And then I have an anthology that I'm solo editing next year. It's also YA horror, and it's called The House Where Death Lives. And it's about a haunted house, and each story follows a monster and a specific room of the house. So that'll be fun. And then I also have a second book, my book 2, coming out sometime next year as well. Another YA horror comedy. So I love that stuff. But I was very excited to write a story in The Gathering Dark. I also love liminal spaces, though I'm not a scholarly lover of liminal spaces. I just, in my free time, enjoy thinking about them. And I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is like a very tourist trap kind of town. But it's interesting because within our city, if you go maybe like 20 miles away from the ocean, it is a very rural space. So we kind of existed in both realms. And growing up in a place where people come to vacation but not really come to stay, I think kind of ignited my love of liminal spaces and sort of temporariness from a young age.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least.
Hi, I'm Shakira Saint. Thank you for having me. The short story that I submitted for this anthology was my debut. I haven't had anything next because I've been really busy with work. But watch this space. Maybe in the next 50 years I might have something else that would be really cool. And you can probably hear from my accent that I'm from London. I was born and raised here, but my grandparents came down during the Windrush generation. I think they came towards the end of the 1960s. I found their old boarding passes, which were really cool. And so I'm really, as you said, quite interested in the movement of people. Obviously, like the Caribbean had a lot of movement, especially with African slaves. And I think I'm really interested in like female identity and mythology and folklore because of it. Like if you think about like mythology, the ethos like of a people, so like the Greek people have mythology, they have a pantheon, but Caribbean doesn't have a pantheon. We have a collection of folkloric stories because that's all we had from slavery, because our pantheons are broken and forgotten and all of that. And so I'm really interested in folklore and how we consolidated the stories that we did have into what we have today, and how a lot of the characters are like female and monstrous. I'm really interested in monstrous women and sort of like turning. Actually, I think at first my interests were like, oh, I want like the monstrous women to be good, and actually at the end of it, I was like, no, I really want them to be bad, and really embrace that, and sort of that's sort of where my story came from and what I'm interested in.
Well, you are all such fascinating people. I'm so excited for this conversation. I can't even stand it. Thank you for introducing yourselves and for sharing a little bit about your interest in place. One of the things that I think is really important for this episode too, and you touched on this, Shakira, is the relationship between folk stories, folkways, and place, and displacement, and the movement across places. Like all of the things that we're talking about, that you've talked about so far, are really connected to folklore. And so I wondered if y'all could define how you understand folklore, what folklore is, for our listeners who may have a feeling about what it is, but may not be able to put into words how they would define it.
I think Shakira did a great job in speaking about it. Really, the idea that these large pantheons of belief systems are mythology, you know, and folklore has more to do with the local spaces surrounding communities and culture, in order to explain and interpret and build and talk about anxieties of spaces and explain why people are there right now. And so it's a palimpsest kind of storytelling process over generations, and yet it's always nuanced too, because the most recent people can be the ones who are the speaker of that story. So it's also an oral storytelling. It tends to be more of an explanation of the region. So it's a very regional, at least that's what I understand. It can be very specific to different regions, even one house to the next or one neighborhood to the next.
Yeah. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I love folklore because, kind of like Olivia was saying, it is so mutable. Like you can change it and shape it and make it your own. Even, you know, if my mom is from the Philippines, so there are a lot of, like, you know, monsters and like things from there, that even if you're talking to like Filipino Americans versus like folks from the Philippines, like our interpretations of them are different, or like the monsters could look slightly different too. And I think that, you know, that's because, like Olivia was saying, there are different sort of anxieties or different things that we go through sort of depending on where we are. So yeah, I do love just how much it changes kind of depending on who you talk to.
Shakira, did you want to add more?
No, I think they did it pretty well.
Okay. One of the things that I think when I think about folklore and folkways is how it really is a lens through which to read the world. What monsters exist, or the explanation of natural phenomena. Like, it's how we read and understand the world around us and other people around us. And so it is really interesting that it does change from like place to place and person to person, house to house, and the way that we interpret those stories and the way that our interpretation tells us how to read the world. And so, and the word, right? Like reading stories and understanding stories that may not be part of our folk tradition, but we may see connections to them in our folk tradition. My dad's family, a lot of them are from East Tennessee, from the Appalachian region. So Mothman and the Jack stories and all of those sort of folk tales have been part of, my life. But it also, even translates into like how we take care of ourselves. So I remember as a kid, I had lots of warts. I'm unfortunately afflicted with that latent virus. And it was really embarrassing, and I remember complaining about it to my grandma Jean, and she was like, oh, just here, let's find the straw broom. We'll take a piece of the straw broom, we'll put it on there, it'll go away. And I was just like, excuse me, that doesn't sound like any kind of science I've ever heard of, But to her, it made complete sense. And you know what? It did go away after we touched it with the straw, And so I was like, well, maybe there is something to this. So, interactions like that too, that like I feel like folklore spans the gamut from like what can hurt us to what can heal us, and then also like how we read what happens in the world. And so one of the things that I loved so much about this story collection is that there are so many different types of folklore represented in each of the stories. And so I wondered if maybe y'all could speak a little bit about that, like what folk traditions you were drawing on in your story, and maybe how that connects to the rural for you. So the Whippoorwill Committee read all of these stories as rural stories. They all felt like rural stories to us. And so I was curious to know if you felt like you were drawing on rural folkloric traditions while you were writing, and how that was important to you in crafting the story.
I can go first if that's okay. So the sort of folkloric figure that my story is based on is a Sukiyon. I'm absolutely saying that wrong, and my uncles are always really mad at me because I can't say it with the accent properly. But it's basically the Caribbean, well, my island Dominica's version of a vampire. I think it's on like Martinique and Guadeloupe as well because they're quite close by. And they think that it came over with like French slavers, which mixed with African slaves' ideas of prototypes of like vampires as well, and became the Sukiyon. And she like tears her skin off at night and flies around as a fireball, which is the first thing that made me like want to write about a Sukiyon because that's pretty cool. Secondary is that so I found out about what a Sukiyon was in relation to what a real life person was first. So I didn't find out about the folklore story. I found out about the person who was a Sukiyon. And I think that's quite a big thing in the Caribbean, where magical realism is not just a literary device, it is what it is. So Sukiyon isn't a folkloric figure, it's that woman down the street who was mean to you. And so that's how I found out about it, and that's how things are presented. I think my island's quite rural. We're called the Nature Island. And so it's not as built up as our islands. It's very rustic. It's very old school. It's very isolating as well. And I think that's probably why I set my story. Number one, I set it in the past because I wanted to have the colonial aspect, but I also wanted the character to be alone. I didn't want it to be like, I'm from London, I'm from a city. I wanted it to be set in a rural setting where, you know, the nights are night, it's deep black, there's no technology about, there's nothing. I wanted it to feel like the type of folklore story that I heard after finding out the Sukiyon was the woman down the street. I wanted it to feel like it was, as we say, back home. And I think that my experiences of going home to see my family, and like, so my part of my family is from the mountains, and it's very much that, like, you know, there's like 60 families and they live on top of a mountain, and it takes like 2 hours to drive there, and there's just nothing for miles and miles. And I wanted you to sort of feel that in the story as well. And obviously I didn't grow up in a rural setting, and so you'll have to tell me if I did it right. But that was sort of what was running through my mind when I started. And I think that answered your question. I kind of forgot about what the question was halfway through. I'm very sorry, that's my cat in the background.
Okay. I tend to be wordy in my questioning, so it's totally understandable that you forgot what I asked. But I think that your response definitely responds to that. I think it's interesting, like the idea of being from a place and also being from a people. So maybe not being from a place, but being from a people from that place. Like, I think that, you know, like the need to get rural right. I don't feel like anybody ever gets it right for everybody, because everybody's, you know, existence is different. But I think when you're drawing on family legacy of being from a place, like, I'm not technically from Appalachia, but so much of my family is, and I was so close to them, and I grew up listening to their stories, that I feel like part of my identity is Appalachian, even if I've never lived in a region recognized by the ARC. And there might be other Appalachians who like don't like that, you know, that sort of disagree with, you know, me calling myself. I usually call myself an Appalachian infused Hoosier. But so I hope I get away with that at least. But I think that your story definitely read to me as rural and remote. And I think that, you know, you're drawing on folklore that originated from that place and the people from that place, who are your people, you know? And so I think there's a lot of things working together. I think there's that argument, right, that if you don't belong to a certain group, you can't write that group's story. And I understand where that's coming from, but I also think that there's nuance to that, and that, you know, that there are other things at work. And yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth, and I have that argument with myself. But I think that what you were talking about sort of brings that idea to the fore of, like, you know, what it means to be from a place, what it means to be from a people, and how that influences how we tell that story.
I think for the Caribbean, I mean, I wouldn't say it's unique, because I'm pretty sure this happens with other diasporas as well. But where we're one remove from even the place that we called home, it's really quite difficult to pinpoint identity. And so when I wanted to write the story, I also wanted it to be like, well, who am I? Where am I? Is this my home? Have I always been here? And that insecurity in identity is something that, like, I, as someone who's like second generation in London, feels. It's probably also something that someone would feel on Dominica as well, because we are the only island to still have our Carib nation. They were wiped out from the rest of the islands by the Spanish, and we still have them. And so even the African slaves who were descendants of the African slaves, like my grandparents, must have felt at some point as well, well, this isn't really my land, because the Caribs are still here. This is their land, and so they would have these anxieties as well. And I wanted that to come across too.
Well, I think it does. I think your story is beautiful, and I think that is wonderfully done. So kudos and congratulations.
Thank
Olivia
you
and
very
Alex,
much.
did you want to speak to the folklore tradition you were drawing on? And actually, Hannah is in the waiting room. Maybe I bring her in now and let her introduce herself, and then I'll pose the question to everybody. Does that sound okay? Is that weird? Okay. Hi, Hannah. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so sorry for being late and lost.
That's okay. So what we are doing right now is, I thought you could introduce yourself and answer the question, like, where you're from and how do you feel like that shapes you as a person or a writer. And then I'll toss up the question that we were just talking about. Does that work? Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and how you feel like that influences you as a person and a writer.
Sure. My name's Hannah Witten. I am the author of For the Wolf and the Nightshade Crown trilogy. And I'm from Cookeville, Tennessee, which is a small town that's like an hour outside of Nashville, which I feel like has shaped me a lot, both as a person and a writer, as far as kind of being drawn to, like, my first duology is completely set in the woods, which I feel like is kind of on the nose as far as growing up in the woods. And a lot of my trauma that we mine for fiction comes from growing up in a small white evangelical town in the South. So yeah, both of those things have shaped who I am and how I write quite a lot.
Well, you're in good company. I was actually just telling everyone else that most of my dad's family, so my dad's mom's family is from the Salina area.
Oh, yeah, I know Salina.
Yeah, my great grandpa worked for the WPA and helped build Dale Hollow Dam.
Wow.
Yeah, and his dad's side of the family is from outside of Knoxville, so more sort of in the hills and in the Appalachian region. So I was just telling them I call myself an Appalachian infused Hoosier because I was really close to them and learned all of the stories and sort of the folkways from them, even though I technically am from and grew up in Indiana. So really welcome. Cool. And we're happy that you're here. And so the question that we were just talking about, I asked what folkloric traditions folks felt like they were drawing on as they were writing their stories, and whether or not and or how so that's connected to the rural for them, since this is a podcast about rural literature. So that's the question that we're talking about now. And whoever wants to go next is welcome to do so.
I can go. So the folklore of my town specifically was honestly the inspiration for One Lane Bridge in the Gathering Dark. There is a bridge about 15 minutes from my house that is supposedly haunted. It is in like described in the story, kind of a backwoods pass between two towns that you're only going to take that way if you've like been here for a really long time, because like otherwise you're just going to take the highway. That's the way your GPS is going to take you. But I live really close to like the mountain that divides those two towns, so anytime I have to go into the other one, I take this road with this bridge that is very isolated. And what inspired the story was I came upon it whenever I was trying to come home from the other town one time, and there was somebody that was stopped on it. I don't know why. And it was in the middle of the day, so it was not nearly as creepy as it is in the story. But because of the way it's constructed and the way the road works, like you can't go around them. Like if somebody is stopped in the middle of that bridge, like you're all just kind of stuck until they decide to move. And I was like, what if there was a bridge like this and someone was stopped for nefarious purposes and things went from there? So that's a very rural problem to have. And just kind of the Appalachian tradition of, you know, if you hear something calling your name from the woods, no, you didn't. Like things just, the woods are very respected, I guess would be a way to phrase it. But just how even around here where, you know, everybody's in church on Sunday, you're still gonna have that healthy respect of, but you don't want to be in the woods at night for reasons.
I think for me, when I was approaching like how I wanted to tell the story, I think that's kind of the way the narrator frames everything. Like she is actively like telling the story to someone. So that for me was important because it's, you know, very folklore, like you're passing down like, you know, this thing. But yeah, she is from a small town that has this belief that when there's a decision that needs to be made, these tunnels will kind of appear and you'll be able to go in them and like make whatever decision you have to make. So I think that's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, you know, like it's a way to interact with and explain the world, wherein these tunnels might not like actually be a thing, but like theoretically, if you do need to make some kind of hard choice, you know, they're there for you. So they kind of symbolize just like taking that journey of like making whatever decision you need to make. And yeah, I feel like it draws on the ruralness just from, you know, again, being like isolated, but also going into scary tunnels at night and you don't really know what's going to happen. It's just very creepy. It's like hearing your name in the woods and you're like, nope, and go the other way. Like you're like, you don't want to go into the tunnel. But I feel like at the same time, part of you is like drawn to it too. And that also feels very folklore-y. Like you're like, this monster does seem kind of scary, but also what if I got a little closer? Like what's going on here? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are tons of folk practices around decision making, whether it's reading tea leaves, whether it's reading chicken bones, whether, you know, whatever it is, like there are all kinds of like decisions are often hard to make. And so like believing and knowing that there are energies in the world that can help you make those decisions, I think can be really comforting. And so I think that there are tons of stories and tons of ways that folks do that. So yeah, I totally see that connection. Olivia, do you
Sure. Yeah. So I think the forest in this story, petrified, is something revered, feared, known, and unknown by outsiders. And I think that's quite common theme in a lot of folklore and fiction in general, is this: the forest is a character in and of itself, a reflection of the community or a reflection of the local people and what they believe. And I think maybe the forest in this story is specifically kind of working against gentrification. And so literally like swallowing up people who come in to knock it down. And it was just me empowering the trees to actually prevent bulldozers and things like that. And also kind of, it is a rural story in that it's dealing with the countryside in Colorado, in the mountains, not countryside, in the mountain community. And the idea that, you know, outsiders come in and what do they do in those spaces and how do they manage them poorly without respect to, you know, the native plants and animals and people. So
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of thinking about like rural environmentalism and how people often feel like that's an oxymoron, but like really like rural people often see themselves as stewards of the environment, and because they live off of it a lot. You know, I grew up on a farm, and so I mean, we watch the weather religiously, and we, you know, like part of our land is wetlands, and so we are very diligent about thinking about how many trees we can cut down or can't cut down to clear for more tillable land or to use to heat our house, because our house is wood heated with the boiler. And so I think that like there's a lot of tension between especially like resource extraction. So if you live in a rural place, it's likely a rural extraction community or in a resource extraction community, because rural places have resources and people come in and they pay you for your mineral rights, but they don't pay you very well, or they're going to frack in your backyard and they're going to give you a little bit so that you allow them to do it, because it's likely that you need that because of other historical movements that and policies that have, crippled your generational wealth and make it so that you have to rely on these extraction industries in a way that doesn't feel good, but also feels necessary. And so like playing on that tension of like we have the utmost respect for the environment, but we have to end up negotiating and navigating relationships with people who don't, in order to survive. I think that that's a very important, super significant and salient aspect of rural stories. And so I was really excited to see that represented in so many of the stories here. I keep, especially with like Nora Shalloway Carpenter's recent publication, Fault Lines. I think there are more and more books like that coming out, more and more stories like yours, Olivia, that ask us to think about how people relate to and have relationships with the environment. And I love the way you put it, that sort of the natural world sort of becomes a reflection of the stories that we tell about it, so that it's not really anthropomorphized by itself, but the stories that we tell of it make it what it is. That's really interesting. Sorry, there's no question in there. Sometimes I just nerd out and have to talk about the ideas that occur to me. I'm a total verbal processor and it just all comes out. So one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of rural literature is the fact that there's like no rural category for publishing or for like bookstores. Like kids can't just go to their library and go to the rural story section when they can find a book, but they can go to the urban fiction section and they can find an urban story there. And so I was wondering about your perspectives on that as people who publish. And I'm just curious about, like, I don't know how to make that happen. Like, how do we make it so that there's a rural category in publishing?
Making new categories in publishing is very difficult.
I imagined it was.
Yeah, there have been a lot, and a lot of it really comes down to capitalism and how it I'll use like the new adult movement, I guess, as like an example. There was a big push a few years ago now where they wanted to make a category that was kind of between YA and adult. And it had a lot of support, like people wanted it, but the major bookstore chains did not want to make an extra section in the bookstores, and that essentially is kind of what killed that off. And I have like mixed feelings about that anyway, because I typically write adult fiction, and it's like all the stuff that people say they want in new adult fiction you can actually find in adult fiction. You just have to like look for it. But it is just an example of how we're very constrained by the I mean, like, publishing is a business. At the end of the day, it's there to make money. And so it's just one example of how like creativity is constrained by money.
Yeah, it seems like nobody really knows how it works too on some level. I think there's some people guessing at this even at the top, and yeah, it's tricky, and categories are tricky. I think another idea is just how to connect readers with the books that they're seeking. Especially younger readers, and putting the anthology together does a lot of good work to do that. Here's a selection of stories that are interesting, could be interesting to you, and maybe it's a gateway kind of connector to other things that Hannah's written or other things that anyone has written in this anthology, to see if they could find something that is interesting to them. It's interesting that there is like an urban idea of fiction, but even in that, when we look at what's in the urban fantasy or the urban, it's not really urban. It's not like just city fiction or just it I don't know who makes these categories. It's really complicated and also very seems very arbitrary, I
Yeah.
don't know.
It's another thing that's kind of driven by what category can we put this in where it's going to make the most money.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think about like how I never really read a book. I mean, I saw my whiteness in a lot of books, but I never really saw my rurality in a lot of books. I tell the story all the time about reading Charlotte's Web and telling my teacher it was a stupid story because it didn't matter if Charlotte was spelling in her spider webs or not. Wilbur was going to go to processing because Fern has to eat. Like that's how her family makes money. And so even if he was the runt of a litter and it took him a little more time to get fat, like as soon as he was big enough, he was going to go to the slaughterhouse because that's how people make their money, because we raised hogs. And so that made sense to me, but that was a very wildly unpopular opinion. And I learned very quickly that is not what I was supposed to gather from this book. But like the idea that like even rural set stories sort of build misconceptions about like rural experiences, especially when read by rural readers. But I think I'm just working from, like the idea that it's important for everyone to see themselves represented in a page, because like that's how we see what identities are possible. That's how we see what identities are worth something, like in a very like in an abstract sense, but in a fiscal sense as well, because like people are gonna buy those books, and if somebody wants to read about your identity, then that makes your identity like worth something. And I've taught at a rural school, and my students wanted to read rural stories, and I didn't really pay much attention to that because I went to a program that taught me what a good book was. And unless it was canonical and the rural was pathologized in some way, like rural stories were not good stories. And so I just think a lot about like how to connect readers with rural stories, which I guess is why I do this. Like I wouldn't be doing this podcast. I wouldn't have my website and stuff if I wasn't trying to do that. But I just keep trying to think of ways to do that. And since I know nothing about the publishing world, as has been evidenced in other comments that I've made during this discussion, having the perspective of people who sort of, inhabit that world, that space, that place in a way that I don't, is really valuable to me. So I appreciate y'all responding to that question. Olivia, you mentioned anthologizing. And like I said in the introduction, like this is the first time that I've ever had, so many contributors from one work, on the podcast. So I'm curious. I mean, Tori's not here to speak for this, but maybe y'all can talk a little bit about it. I'm curious about what the inspiration was for this particular project, and what the anthologizing process is like. Like, what are the joys and challenges of contributing a piece to a larger work? That's a lot of questions in a row. Just answer the ones that you remember. I'm sorry. I can't help myself.
I mean, as a contributor, I can only speak as somebody who was turning in a story and writing for this larger scope and this vision that Tori had. It was super fun. I mean, how fun is that to write, to be inspired? Oh, excuse me, my dog.
That's okay.
To write a story, and she was such a pleasure to work with, and the editing team was amazing, and the artwork is just out of control. So we really I had such a great time. I think we all did, just contributing the stories and being a part of this larger project. It was so fun. I can't speak for Tori, but I know she's very passionate about this field of literature, and she's a really talented author in her novels and all these projects he pulls together. So yeah.
Can I go the other way? And I'm also going to agree because it was amazing. We're not going to sit here and be like, oh God, it was awful. But I also, because obviously this is my first foray into publishing anything. And I think typically when you write your own stories, you know what the theme is beginning to end. And I think I found it difficult to be able to anticipate what everybody else was going to interpret the subject to be like. And I think I had a lot of anxiety of like, is this going to fit in? Is this going to be okay? And in the end, I was so busy with work that I was just like, well, this is just what's going to be. And I don't have any time to change it. I was like writing on a train to Birmingham to an awards show. And I was like, I didn't have any time. And I was like, this is what it's going to be. If they hate it, they hate it. It's fine. But I remember on the lead up, I was so like worried that I would interpret it wrong. And obviously that's really silly looking back on it because everyone's interpretation is completely valid. But maybe that's just because I'm so junior in this compared to the others. But yeah, I did. There was a measure of like large anxiety about whether or not I would be able to interpret it right and whether or not it was like the right sort of folklore. In terms of just like, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, I think that makes total sense. And I'll kind of jump off that in that whenever you're trying to make an anthology that is like of a genre, you're always going to piss somebody off because there's going to be somebody that has a different idea of what that genre should be. Like, so like horror movies and horror in general is like one of my niche interests. So folk horror specifically, if you really drill down into like what people have agreed, like this is the basis of folk horror. It's 3 British horror movies. It's The Wicker Man, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Witchfinder General, I believe, or like they call them the Unholy Trinity. And that's like the basis of folk horror. So if you're going to go off of that definition, first of all, like, you know, American folklore has nothing to do with it. And it does kind of have like that rurality to it, especially the Wicker Man, because like the whole point of the Wicker Man is like the only reason that these things are still happening is because it's a very isolated community. But also, it just creates a very narrow view of, okay, so it's only folk horror if it is about a group of people that are practicing like an old folk religion. Like that's folk horror. If it goes outside of that, then it's not folk horror, it's something else. It's, you know, rural horror. It's, you can come up with all these different categories. And I mean, you know, you can pathologize it to death and like categorize everything. So I have seen some reactions to the book that are like, this is great, but it's not folk horror. And it's like, okay, but who is deciding what that is? Because no one really knows. And whenever Tori was first like DMing me about like, hey, if I wanted to put together like a folk horror anthology, would you want to be into it? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. It was more this idea of like horror taking place, you know, yes, in small communities, but kind of more pulling from folklore and pulling from a bunch of different backgrounds and like all the different ways you can interpret this folk horror thing. And it was also kind of having a resurgence at the time because, you know, like A24 is really popping off and doing like The Witch and Men and stuff like that. All of those are movies that could be qualified as folk horror. So it was kind of a buzzword, especially whenever it was first coming out. So it was interesting, to see how we all interpreted it in our contributions and also how that was interpreted by the wider audience, especially people who like know their folklore.
Yeah, and I think like for me when I was thinking about the story, I love urban legends. The movie one, but also just in general, like urban legends, like as a kid, you know, like Bloody Mary and all that stuff. And to me, like urban legends like are folklore too. So like that's kind of, you know, how I approached it. But yeah, I totally see what Hannah was saying, where some people were like, yeah, some of these were just like urban legends though. And it's like, but they can be the same thing. Like there's still traditions you pass down. Like they share the same DNA. They just might not, you know, have originated kind of in the same place or within the same communities. So yeah, you know, I think I loved writing the story. I loved like tapping into like the urban legend part of my brain. I feel like the challenge when you're used to writing like bigger things is to kind of just distill it down to like a small, little portion of words. But I feel like that's also the fun in it, because you're like, this can only be 5,000 words and then I'm out of here. Like, so
Yeah.
I feel like it's very, like Shakira was saying, it's easier to like kind of make your thesis statement and your theme and like, kind of just state it, I feel like a lot clearer than maybe like in a longer form.
It's a great opportunity to use an idea that you're like, I don't think I can make this a whole book, but I can definitely make it a short story.
Yes.
I love that,
Yeah.
like the economy of ideas. Sorry, was I talking over somebody?
No, every time I write a short story for an anthology, I think I write 3 different versions of it first, or maybe even 4. This was definitely not the first version. I think I wrote something totally different and in many different places and ways. And it is, I love what Alex said about like, hurry up. You can only do this 3,000 words. I can write that in maybe a day or 2. Not that I wrote the story in a day or 2, but that's the quantity of words. So maybe I can write 3 versions of this to see which one is the right one for this and throw out the rest. It's much faster. You can't do that with a novel, or at least I can't. It takes me much longer. So it's kind of a nice exercise, a fun exercise to see, oh, what do I think about this? Because you write to find out what you think sometimes.
One of the things that we've noticed on the Whippoorwill Committee is that a lot of our submissions are in like the horror genre. And so I was wondering if we could think a little bit about like, or you could talk a little bit about why you think that is. Like, what is it about the rural that's so scary? Or what is it about the rural that's so creepy? Like, kind of connecting to Hannah's discussion of the Wicker Man, I think there are a lot of like, like Children of the Corn, and there, even something like The Shining, it's remote. So, I don't think rural is always remote, but I think remote almost always qualifies as rural, even if it's a swanky hotel in the middle of nowhere. So, I mean, I think we've all mentioned the isolation that comes with remoteness as being something that is a little off-putting and can be a little scary. But what other things in terms of either like geospatial issues, identity, like the way, the sort of story we tell about rural America or rural anywhere, like what do you think makes it sort of a go-to place, or I don't know, like a frequent place where horror is set?
I think a lot of it has to do with history and how in urban areas, things are constantly moving, and there's not a lot of history that's just kind of left. And in a lot of rural spaces, that history is very close. And in a lot of particularly American rural spaces, it's horrible. And I think that we use horror, to kind of contextualize real world horrors and make sense of them and talk about them. And I think that in rural spaces, a lot of those histories and stuff like that just feels closer because things have not moved on as quickly. You have people who, live in the same town for generations, and houses that have been abandoned for decades. And that's just kind of normal in a rural setting. So you're just existing kind of in this miasma of typically dreadful history, and that lends itself to trying to contextualize it within a horror lens.
I also think it's, so just to add to that like so many people live in cities, and I'm not sort of classing, I'm classing rural as small towns, but I mean like the really, really small towns. I think what it is that when you live in a city, you know the dangers, you understand what's dangerous about a city, right? It's learned behavior, you learn it from when you're young, you're densely populated, you know what's frightening. Most of the people who will be buying these books are people who probably do live in cities as well. And so what's interesting about it and what's probably draws them to it and is that there's the horror of the unknown. If I have lived in a city and I only ever go back to visit my family sometimes in the mountains, what's scary to me is that when it's past 8 o'clock, I look up to the sky and there's no stars. There's a moon, but it's very far away and there's no stars. And I'm not saying I get many in London, but I can see it at Ryan's Belt. And I can see like more than 10 feet in front of my aunt's house. That fear of the unknown, the fear of not being able to see anything and being frightened and by yourself is I think goes with rurality more than sort of the pastoral setting. I always feel like when I think about like pastoral books, I think about like, I don't know, like English garden parties and like, I don't know, Mr. Darcy's coming, and it's all really, you know, like, yeah, sure, we own a farm and it's hard going, but we're good people and we're honest and like all these things happen, but in the end it's really great. And rurality is different because rural is wild, and with that wildness comes that horror of what is lurking in the shadows, and that same horror isn't really, I don't know, maybe it is, but for me, I don't associate it with like pastoral novels. I associate it with rurality. Like I know you were saying earlier about Charlotte's Web, like it just wouldn't happen because, well, that would just be the produce and that's what we have to do, and that's fine. Rurality is that sort of like life is brutal because we have to do this because we have to eat or we have to make money. And that mentality breeds horror in a way that's different than if it's a setting like in a city. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's always what I thought.
Yeah, I think
agree.
that's an interesting point. Like horror exists where surviving is hard, you know. If you're in a city where there are lots of different amenities, I mean, not that surviving is easy in a city, because I don't think that it is, but I think there's sort of this I don't know, this narrative or this thought that like where there's a bunch of infrastructure, surviving is easier. Where there's not as much infrastructure and, you know, you're sort of like living off the land and you're watching the weather to find out if it's going to rain, to see if your crops make it, or if you're going to have to call the crop adjuster to see if you can eat, you know, like that kind of survival, I think, you know, is hard. So that's an interesting, I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. Sorry, did I start to talk over somebody?
I'm just making sense of everything everyone's saying because it's so smart and it's so fascinating. I think one of the things that kind of, just to connect, like Hannah was speaking about, the palimpsest landscape and the horrors within the spaces, which is so true. Living in that same space over generations, making sense of it, but like kind of being stuck with the history in that locality was fascinating. And then the actual physicality, Shakira was talking about the physicality of being in that rural space and how that changes your perspective and your connection to the spaces around you, the literal darkness of the space. That's so fascinating. One thing I was thinking about also is the idea that on a kind of unconscious level, the idea that the rural space or the space that is uncontrolled by people in a kind of architectural landscape, right? Not managed and planned. And that's kind of how I think about the opposite of rural as a planned society, that planned system of some kind. It is kind of this liminal space that makes us worried as a reader or a person or a viewer about, it calls into question our existence. In these liminal spaces, there could be ghosts, there could be things that are kind of challenging our memory, our history, how we have been presented with our history. A lot of these things are stories that have been cleaned up and changed as we move forward. You know, what is our past? You know, and we see this a lot in America currently. You know, historical denial of certain things, and no, this didn't happen there, and kind of like a cleansing of our historical our history in general, which I don't think that's great. I think that's terrible. I think you can't magic the past. Past is past, right? And let's talk about it, and let's continue forward, right? And so I think those spaces can bring into question they make us nervous. And I think that's why a lot of horror has to do with this liminal space, is because it makes us nervous. It makes us anxious. What's there? And it kind of on a larger scale represents our greatest anxiety, existential anxiety. If a ghost exists, then what are we here? It brings another level of question. So,
and also, like, if a ghost exists, then you can't pretend that didn't happen.
Totally. Here I am,
Yeah.
a reminder of what you did or what happened in the past.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that especially when you are kind of looking at it through the lens of how we use horror to reckon with real world things, and in rural spaces, stereotypically, you're going to have people that don't want to reckon with things that have happened there, and that invest a lot of time and energy in pretending that it didn't, but it's there. And we see you drive past the skeletons of it every day. And that mental tension between wanting to ignore it and there being literal physical things showing you like, no, this happened. Like, we can't pretend like it didn't, is a pretty ripe ground for horror.
Yeah, I was thinking, as y'all were talking about, A.S. King talked about, it was in one of her award speeches. She talked about how like there's trauma in the earth, like there's trauma in the earth, and so like the closer you are to the earth, you're closer to that trauma because it hasn't been built over by buildings and by human infrastructure, like and when the traumas of the past occurred a lot on farms, or at trees, like you can't deny that the tree outside the courthouse was the lynching tree, like you can't deny that. There are pictures of it, there. So when you walk by it during the pork festival, you know what it is, even if you don't want to acknowledge that that's what it was, or, like the monuments that were made to historical tragedies and mass murder, like you can't, the closer you are to the blood in the earth, the closer you are to that trauma. And I think that there's something really scary about that. And I hadn't thought about that before we had this conversation. So I really appreciate y'all sharing. This is fascinating to me. I did take a look at the time. But Alex, do you have anything that you want to add to this discussion about like what makes the rural scary, or what makes the rural a good setting for horror?
I mean, everyone said everything so smartly. My one thought was kind of my silly little brain going, but I love like searching through Reddit and finding like, I'm a retired park ranger. Here are all the terrifying things I found in the woods. So that's like where my mind went. I think about, there's one story or a lot of stories where they're like, sometimes you just find staircases in the middle of the forest and like you're not supposed to get on them. And I'm like, how were they there? Like, who put them there? Like, going back to like the fear of the unknown and the anxieties, like, why do you not get on the staircases? What happens if you get on them? So yeah, I think it is just a lot of like, it's the wildness. Like, you never know what you're gonna find. You don't know kind of like who or what was there. And I think just that whole lingering question of like, who are we on this earth, like in this universe, like in this physical realm. I feel like a lot of that comes to light when you are just kind of wandering around the woods and you find like a staircase there.
Yeah. Well, on that note, on that scary note, I just want to say once again how wonderful all of y'all's stories were. I absolutely loved this collection. I really loved each of your stories, and I really appreciate y'all being here and for being gracious about my nerdiness, and also being so willing to share your thoughts on these things that are interesting to me and that I hope are interesting to other people too.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us. Your nerdiness was the best bit.
That was
Thank you
great.
so much. And I will definitely be keeping an eye out for future projects from all of y'all. So I hope to see some really great things in the future.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.